Welcome to the deep dive.
Hey there.
We've got quite a stack of sources here today. We're really plunging into a pretty tumultuous period, late medieval, early modern church and society.
Yeah, it's a time where you just see constant friction, deep faith rubbing up against very worldly power, old beliefs clashing with new ideas.
And just the basic tension between like ideals and what was actually happening inside these big institutions.
Definitely.
So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to sift through all this information in the sources, pull out the key nuggets for you, the listener.
Yeah, try and make sense of how belief and power and conflict all sort of tangled together back then.
We'll meet some fascinating characters, reformers, rebels, popes, prophets, lots of trials, tribulations.
And yeah, the really dark side too.
Yeah.
Magic, persecution, it gets intense.
Okay, let's start unpacking this then.
Sounds good. So where's the best place to start peeling back these layers? I think maybe looking inside the church is a good first step. Specifically, the Franciscan Order. There were some major internal conflicts brewing there early on.
Right, because you have St. Francis setting this incredibly high bar, absolute poverty, like literally owning nothing, not just individually, but as an order.
An amazing ideal. But then the order just explodes in popularity and size. And the question becomes, how do you actually run that? How do you maintain that original vision?
And that's where the tension pops up almost immediately, right? After Francis dies, you get figures like Elias stepping in.
Yeah, Elias was much more, let's say, pragmatic, maybe even worldly,
Yeah.
focused on managing the growth, consolidating control, ambitious guy.
Which naturally put him at odds with those who were really trying to stick to Francis's original super strict vision. People like Giovanni Parenti, John of Parma.
Exactly. Those guys tried to uphold the stricter interpretation. And this wasn't just a minor disagreement. It led to these deep, lasting splits that the sources document. You basically get the spirituals,
The hardliners on poverty.
right, versus the conventuals who were saying, look, we need buildings, we need resources to actually function as an order. More pragmatic, you could say.
And this wasn't just some internal debate club thing. It went right to the top, didn't it? The popes had to get involved.
Oh, yeah. The sources mentioned Pope Boniface VIII. He issued this bull, Exit Qui Seminat.
What was the significance of that one?
Well, Boniface tried to sort of thread the needle. He declared the Franciscan rule itself was inspired by the Holy Spirit and that renouncing property, even communally, was meritorious. So it seemed like a nod to the stricter side, in principle at least.
Okay, so that sounds like it should have settled things, but...
But then comes Pope John the XXII, and he takes a completely different tack. He starts digging into the details of Christ's own poverty. He argued that actually Christ and the apostles did hold some property, at least communally, the common purse, that kind of thing.
Ah, okay, so he's building a case against absolute poverty.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. John XXII goes further. He declares that the belief in absolute poverty, the core ideal of St. Francis, is actually heresy.
Wow. That's huge. To declare the founder's ideal heretical.
It was a bombshell. His bull quorumdom caused massive uproar. Huge opposition from within the Franciscans, even their own general, Michel de Cesena, pushed back hard.
And did that conflict just disappear?
Not at all. Those sources show it just kept simmering. It led to later groups, like the Fraticelli, these splinter groups, who were specifically persecuted because they insisted on that strict poverty ideal.
So the takeaway here is what? That even internal debates about ideals can become these brutal power struggles.
Pretty much. It shows how interpretations of core beliefs, even something like poverty, could lead to deep division, persecution, and violence within a major religious institution. It wasn't just theology, it was about who gets to define the rules.
Okay, so that internal struggle within the Franciscans, it wasn't happening in isolation, right? There were other currents swirling around, other ways people were questioning the church.
Definitely. And sometimes these challenges drew on really powerful, almost mystical ideas, like the influence of Joachim of Fiore.
Joachim. Yeah, he pops up a lot. He wasn't exactly a dissenter like the spiritual Franciscans, but his writings, they had a huge impact.
Huge. His prophecies about the different ages of church history, the age of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, people were constantly interpreting them, often in ways that were pretty critical of the current church hierarchy.
The sources mention texts like De Ultima, Edictati Ecclesiae, and the Liber Conformitatem drawing on his ideas.
Right. And Joachim himself wasn't totally uncontroversial, even on pure theology. His ideas about the Trinity, for instance, were condemned way back at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Innocent III himself preached against them.
So he always had this slightly edgy relationship with the official church doctrine?
hmm But his followers, the Joachites, they kept his ideas alive, sometimes underground. The sources talk about this pestiferous doctrine of the everlasting gospel.
Sounds ominous.
Yeah, it seems like a radical interpretation of his work. They apparently had secret groups, even headquarters down in the south of France. Authorities definitely tried to stamp them out. There was a synod in Arles in 1265 specifically targeting them.
And this is where it gets really interesting politically speaking, right? Because if you start interpreting prophecies to say the current age of the church is corrupt or that the pope is a pseudo-pope.
Exactly. You're essentially using prophecy as a weapon against the existing power structure. And that's a very quick way to find yourself accused of heresy. It shows how these mystical or prophetic ideas could become incredibly dangerous, politically charged tools.
And that kind of challenge, whether it came from prophecy or internal fights over poverty, it wasn't just limited to those specific groups.
No. You see lots of other movements cropping up. People feeling the church had kind of lost its way, maybe just trying to live a simpler, purer life outside the official channels.
The sources mention how after the big mendicant orders like the Franciscans and Dominicans got approved and became successful, lots of other groups tried to copy them, but without getting the official okay.
Right. The Lateran Council had actually forbidden new unauthorized orders, but they kept appearing anyway. The sources called them a serious nuisance to the establishment.
Like the Apostolic Brethren, founded by Segarelli.
Yeah, they're a key example. They were really committed to perfect poverty, extreme asceticism. Almost like they were trying to live out that radical Franciscan ideal, but completely outside the official Franciscan structure.
And they weren't totally ostracized at first.
No, initially they even got some protection from local figures like Bishop Opizo. But their popularity, their very existence as an alternative, started drawing negative attention.
And things got violent.
Yeah, the sources mention a grim incident, 3 of the brethren being hanged in Bologna around 1286. That definitely put them on the map in a bad way.
Were they just quietly practicing poverty, or were they actively critical?
Oh, they were critical. Their message was rooted in prophecies about the downfall of the, quote, wicked rich church and clergy. Segarelli even claimed his group represented a whole new fourth state of the church, replacing the corrupt one.
And his successor, Fra Dolcino, he took it even further.
He did. Dolcino led this armed resistance movement from mountain hideouts. His prophecies were even more direct, claiming that basically all popes and prelates, since way back in Pope Sylvester's time, were frauds, seducers, whose pardons and blessings were worthless.
While still practicing extreme poverty themselves.
Yeah, that commitment to poverty and self-denial remained central.
The sources briefly mention others too, right? Like the Waldenses.
They shared a prohibition on taking oaths. And the Brethren of the Free Spirit, who had this idea that they were spiritually perfect, impeccable, plus groups like the Guglielmites, the sect of the Spirit.
It's quite a mix. What does this diversity tell you?
Well, it really highlights how many people were looking for something different, something outside the official church. Whether it was about purity, poverty, rejecting wealth, or seeking a more direct spiritual experience, they felt the institution wasn't providing it. And inevitably, that put them on a collision course with the authorities who claimed, a monopoly on faith.
Now, all these challenges and dissenting groups, they didn't just spring up in a vacuum. The sources paint a pretty bleak picture of what was going on inside the church hierarchy at the time.
Yeah, that's a really important backdrop. Widespread corruption seems to have been a major issue, or at least perceived as one.
The sources talk about things like simony.
Right, the buying and selling of church offices, but also selling justice, selling pardons, selling benefices, basically, church positions that came with an income.
And Pope John the 22nd, the same one who condemned Franciscan poverty, he gets called out specifically.
He does. For shameless traffic in benefices. Apparently, it was a major source of revenue for him, and it caused bitter complaints that echoed for like a century, even surfacing at the Council of Siena later on.
And it wasn't just financial stuff. Clerical behavior in general.
Described in pretty stark terms by contemporary critics cited in the sources, like Berthold of Ratisbon or Stephen Langton, this kind of internal situation definitely added fuel to the fire for groups demanding reform or rejecting the hierarchy altogether.
And the church wasn't just dealing with internal issues, it was flexing its muscles in the political arena too, often aggressively.
Very much so. The sources show popes using religious tools, like crusades, not just against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against their Christian political rivals in Europe.
Like Emperor Frederick II.
Frederick II is a classic case.
Yeah.
He clashed repeatedly with the papacy.
Yeah.
And how did they attack him? They condemned him as a contumacious heretic.
Was he actually promoting heresy?
It seems less about his specific theological beliefs and more about his political defiance of the Pope. But the label of heretic was powerful. It allowed them to declare his lands forfeit, to rally opposition against him. It shows heresy becoming a potent political weapon.
And Manfred of Naples, too.
Same kind of situation. Political opponent gets hit with the crusade weapon.
This whole blurring of spiritual and temporal power must have raised some eyebrows.
Absolutely. It led thinkers to start questioning the Church's claims to worldly authority. You get figures like Marsilius of Padua and Jean de Gendun.
Ah, the Defensor Patience.
Exactly. In that book, they argued something radical for the time, that legitimate civil authority comes from the people, not from God via the Pope.
That sounds like a direct challenge to papal power.
It was. And guess who went after them? John XXII again. He persecuted them for those ideas.
So what's the big picture here?
Well, it really seems to show how religious language and tools, accusations of heresy, excommunication crusades, got tangled up with very earthly concerns: political power, territory, money. The Church wielded its spiritual authority for worldly ends, and that in turn just generated more opposition and criticism.
Okay, so we see these big forces, internal dissent, corruption, political maneuvering, but it becomes incredibly real and, frankly, dramatic when you look at specific individuals who got caught in the crosshairs, like Savonarola in Florence.
So Savonarola is such a compelling, almost theatrical example. Here's a Dominican friar, a preacher, who gains this massive popular following.
Through fiery sermons, right? Denouncing corruption, predicting doom.
Exactly.
Mm.
And for a while, he basically ruled Florence through his moral authority. But that kind of power, especially when it's challenging the existing political and religious establishment, is bound to create enemies.
And he made powerful ones. The ruling Signoria in Florence, especially factions like the Arrabbiati who opposed him, and crucially, Pope Alexander VI.
Yeah, Pope Alexander VI, the Borgia Pope, not exactly known for his piety. He and Savonarola were like oil and water.
The sources describe this escalating conflict pretty vividly. His preaching gets forbidden.
Right. He defies the ban. Then there's intimidation. Someone even smears filth on his pulpit before a sermon. The Pope tries everything, issuing papal bulls against him, eventually excommunicating him.
And the pressure just kept mounting on Florence itself.
Immense pressure. Alexander VI basically told the city, hand over this monstrous idol, as he called Savonarola, or face an interdict, which would shut down all church services. That was a huge threat.
Which ultimately led to his downfall, arrest, trial.
And torture. The sources specifically mention how confessions and political statements were wrung from him under duress.
So the confession wasn't necessarily genuine.
Highly questionable, given the methods. And despite his execution, he was hanged and burned. They couldn't completely erase his influence. Attempts to suppress his memory kind of failed. Later on, people even looked at his actual writings and found no real heresy in them.
And the sources even mention his relics being venerated. That's quite a twist.
It is. Shows the enduring power he had for some people. And then, kind of parallel in some ways, you have Joan of Arc, another iconic figure wrapped up in claims of the supernatural.
But viewed so differently depending on who you asked, right?
Totally. The sources lay this out clearly. For the French, her victories, like lifting the siege of Orleans, were miraculous, divine intervention, proof God was on their side.
But for the English and their allies, like the Regent Bedford?
It had to be the opposite. Her success couldn't be from God, so it must be from the devil. The sources quote them calling it falls enchantements and sorcery. She was a disciple and limb of the fiend, a limb of the fiend.
Her capture was the crucial turning point.
Yes. She falls into the hands of Burgundian allies of the English, who then sell her to the English. And they hand her over to churchmen sympathetic to their cause, like Bishop Pierre Carchon, who orchestrates the trial.
And the trial itself, as the sources describe it, it sounds relentless.
It was. Repeated interrogations, intense psychological pressure, twisting her words.
What kind of things did they use against her, according to the trial records mentioned?
Oh, a whole range. Her visions and voices, obviously were they from God or demons? Her wearing men's clothes was seen as an abomination, defying God's order. Even her leap from a tower when captured was interpreted as an attempted suicide, a mortal sin.
And then there was the abjuration, her temporary recanting.
Right, under immense pressure, She apparently signed something renouncing her claims, but then she seemed to have regretted it, or perhaps was tricked. She resumed wearing men's clothes in prison. This was seen as a relapse into heresy.
And that relapse sealed her fate.
That was the justification used to hand her over to be burned.
The sources also mentioned she wasn't entirely unique. There were imitators.
Yeah, figures like Catherine de la Rochelle, who also claimed visions, or this peasant leader called the Shepherd, Guillaume, they also faced investigation and persecution. It seems Joan's fame perhaps inspired others, but the authorities were quick to clamp down.
So if you connect the dots between Savonarola and Joan, what's the link?
I think it's about figures who gain significant popular power or influence based on claims of divine inspiration or supernatural gifts. When that authority challenges the established political or religious hierarchies, those hierarchies push back hard. They use the tools they have, accusations of heresy, sorcery, political rebellion, to discredit and destroy the threat, even if there's huge popular support or later evidence suggests the charges were baseless.
And that mention of sorcery with Joan of Arc brings us squarely into probably the darkest area we're looking at today. Magic and witchcraft.
Yeah, it's a heavy topic. The belief in magic and spirits and hidden forces. The sources show this goes way back. It wasn't invented in the Middle Ages. They mention roots in ancient cultures, Akkads, Assyrians, Gauls, Welsh, even Hebrew traditions had elements of this.
And how did the law deal with it initially? Was it always seen as evil?
It varied a lot. Roman law, for instance, was pretty tough on certain kinds of divination and astrology, especially anything that seemed politically threatening, like predicting the emperor's death. They went after those Chaldeans, as they call them.
What about later under the Germanic or barbarian kingdoms?
The laws were all over the place. Some imposed fines for specific harmful magic. Others were largely silent. You had figures like the Sadekoner in Scandinavia, the seeresses or sorceresses, who were genuinely feared for things like raising storms or cursing enemies.
And the church's view, did it stay consistent?
No, it definitely evolved. Early on, the church focused on stamping out lingering pagan practices, often prescribing penance rather than death. For centuries, there seems to have been a kind of almost practical tolerance for a lot of folk, magic, healing charms, that sort of thing, as long as it didn't veer into explicit demon worship.
But then there was a shift.
A crucial shift. Especially from the 14th century onwards, you see this increasing tendency to link sorcery and witchcraft directly with heresy.
Making it a much more serious offense in the eyes of the church.
Exactly. And a key moment highlighted in the sources is that bull from Pope John the XXII, again, Super Aurelius Specula, around 1320. That really gave a major push towards prosecuting sorcery, especially anything involving calling on demons as a form of heresy, punishable by the church.
What kinds of things were people accused of?
All sorts. Drawing on folk fears, mainly. Harming people or animals using magic, making wax figurines to curse enemies. The sources mention alleged plots like this against King Charles le Bel and even John XXII himself. Raising storms was a common one. Invoking demons, obviously.
And the Sabbath, the witches' meeting.
Yeah, the idea of the Sabbath starts to emerge more strongly. These supposed nocturnal gatherings with the devil. Though interestingly, the sources note that even at the time, some church authorities, citing older texts like the Canon Episcopi, argued these experiences were just illusions, dreams, demonic tricks, not physical reality. But that view lost ground.
And the prosecution methods. We touched on this with Savonarola and Joan. Torture.
Torture became absolutely central to witchcraft trials. The sources are explicit about this. They mention the trials in Arras as a specific grim example.
What happened there?
People like Denizelle, Margot, Marianne, even a knight, Chevalier de Beaufort, were tortured relentlessly until they produced these incredibly detailed confessions about attending Sabbaths, flying, worshiping the devil, implicating others. Confessions they often retracted later, if they survived.
And influential texts promoted this.
Yes. While Sprenger's Malleus Maleficarum isn't named directly in the text provided, the description fits perfectly advising inquisitors to use fraud or force, meaning deception and torture, to get confessions. And crucially, this approach got papal endorsements from Innocent VIII and Alexander VI, which gave it huge authority.
The consequence sounds terrifying. It became dangerous to even question it.
That's exactly what the sources say. To doubt the reality of witchcraft, to question the confessions extracted under torture, could make you suspect of heresy. It created this vicious cycle where the very process of persecution fueled and validated the belief.
And the sources even suggest inquisitors stimulated belief in witchcraft.
Yeah, by constantly searching for it, asking leading questions under torture, they arguably spread and solidified the very ideas they were supposedly fighting.
It really makes you pause and think. These accusations seem so wild to us now. Flying ointment, devil worship. Yet people were systematically tortured, killed based on this.
It's a chilling look at how institutional belief systems, amplified by fear and empowered by legal tools like torture, can lead to horrific outcomes, regardless of the objective reality.
And it wasn't just disagreeing with the Pope or being accused of witchcraft that could land you in deep trouble. Even arguing about theology, about the finer points of doctrine, that could become a capital offense too.
Absolutely. The sources highlight a really fierce debate, the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary.
Okay, so what was their argument about, basically?
Well, it boils down to whether Mary, like all other humans, was conceived with original sin, or if she was uniquely preserved from it from the very moment of her conception through God's grace, because she was destined to be the mother of Christ.
And there were two main camps fighting over this.
Very much so. On one side, pushing for the Immaculate Conception, were the Franciscans, heavily influenced by the theologian Duns Scotus.
Okay, and opposing them?
Were the Dominicans, following their heavyweight theologian Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas argued that Mary, like everyone else, needed Christ's redemption, which implies she must have had original sin at conception, even if cleansed very shortly after. To say otherwise for him seemed to diminish the universality of Christ's saving work.
And this wasn't just a friendly debate.
Not at all. The sources describe it as incredibly intense. Whichever order had more power in a particular area would denounce the other side as heretics, sometimes leading to actual persecution.
Wow, heresy over that specific point.
Yes, it got that heated. Popes and councils kept getting dragged into it. John the 22nd, interestingly, was initially against the doctrine. Later councils, like one in Avignon 1457, tried to mediate. Eventually, popes like Paul V issued decrees that basically told the Dominicans to stop publicly attacking the doctrine, effectively siding with the Franciscan view, or at least silencing the opposition.
And there's a really strange story from Bernay mentioned.
Yeah, it's wild. Around 1507, a Dominican friar claimed the Virgin Mary herself had appeared to him. And what did she supposedly say?
Let me guess. She sided with the Dominicans.
Exactly. She supposedly confirmed Thomas Aquinas' view and said that Franciscans were suffering in purgatory specifically because they promoted the Immaculate Conception.
That's taking theological debate to a whole new level. Spiritual warfare, almost.
Pretty much. And even though there were official attempts to quiet the public arguments, the controversy didn't go away. If someone violated the prohibitions, the sources say they could be sent to Rome for judgment by the highest church court.
So again, it shows how doctrine wasn't just abstract. It was tightly controlled. And disagreeing, even on what seems like a subtle point to us, could have serious legal consequences. The institution guarded its dogma fiercely. Okay, so we've seen all these different types of perceived threats. Internal dissent like the Franciscans, prophetic challenges like the Joachites, unauthorized groups like the Apostolic Brethren, political opposition that gets labeled heresy, accusations of witchcraft, even theological debates. How did the church actually enforce its view across the board? What was the mechanism?
The main engine for enforcing conformity and combating all these perceived forms of heresy, according to the sources, was the Inquisition.
And its job wasn't just hunting down people with different religious beliefs.
No, its scope was much broader.
Yeah.
Officially, it dealt with heresy, but that definition expanded. It covered cases savoring of heresy, which explicitly came to include things like invoking demons, linking it directly to the witchcraft persecutions we talked about.
And its methods. The sources paint a pretty stark picture.
They do. It was a system designed to get convictions. Methods included investigation or perquisition, seizing the accused's property right away, using networks of spies and informants, interrogation under oath crucially, without the right to remain silent, effectively forcing self-incrimination.
And torture was a key part.
Absolutely central. The sources use that chilling phrase, few indeed from whom the inquisitorial process could not wring conviction. Torture was the tool to achieve that.
Did they need a confession to convict?
Confession was the goal, highly valued. But the sources say conviction was possible even without one, if the inquisitors felt the evidence from witnesses or other means was sufficient. They also used the idea of continuation of torture, meaning they could pause a session and resume it later, claiming it wasn't a new session, to get around rules limiting torture duration.
And the whole process was secret.
Deeply secret. The sources mention how hard it was even to find out who had passed a sentence. This secrecy protected the accusers and judges and terrified the accused. And confiscation of property was a standard part of the sentence, providing a financial incentive as well.
What happened to those found guilty?
For those who refused to recant or who relapsed after recanting once before, The sentence was usually relaxation to the secular arm.
Which means,
The church court technically didn't shed blood itself. It handed the condemned person over to the local secular authorities, the king, the prince, the city government, with the expectation, indeed the requirement, that they would execute the sentence, which usually meant burning at the stake in a public ceremony, the auto de fe.
so the church and state had to cooperate.
Yes, the secular power was needed for arrests and executions, but the jurisdiction over the crime of heresy belonged to the church court. This sometimes led to friction, though. The sources mention secular rulers sometimes dragging their feet on executions, drawing curses from inquisitors like Springer, or arguments over who got control of the confiscated property, like with the Templars.
And who did they actually target with this system? It wasn't just small fringe groups.
Not at all. The targets were incredibly broad
Yeah.
based on these sources. Yes, religious dissenters, but also, as we've seen, thousands accused of witchcraft. The incredibly wealthy and powerful Knights Templar, where the accusations of heresy seemed clearly driven by King Philip V's desire for their wealth, with Pope Clement V's cooperation. Political opponents of the papacy, like Emperor Frederick II or Louis of Bavaria, and even, as we saw with the Immaculate Conception debate, theological rivals within the church could find themselves facing inquisitorial judgment.
So how effective was it?
In terms of suppressing open dissent and alternative religious movements, it was brutally effective in many places. It instilled widespread fear. But, as the sources suggest, particularly with witchcraft, it might have been counterproductive in the long run, actually amplifying the very fears and beliefs it aimed to crush. The track of blood and fire it left behind is undeniable.
When you step back and look at the Inquisition as described here.
It really looks like a powerful, centralized system designed to enforce absolute conformity in belief, in practice, in obedience. And its definition of heresy was incredibly flexible, capable of serving not just theological aims, but also political power, financial interests, and institutional control. It really makes you think about how power structures define what's true and what's deviant, doesn't it?
We have certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. It's quite a journey through this period.
It really is. We started with those internal struggles, like within the Franciscans over poverty, showing how even ideals could become battlegrounds.
Then the influence of prophecy, figures like Joachim of Fiore, and how those ideas could be seen as dangerous challenges to the status quo.
We looked at that whole range of other dissenting groups, Apostolic Brethren, Waldenses, and others, just trying to find different ways to live out their faith, often clashing with the official structures.
And underpinning so much of it was that backdrop of perceived and likely real corruption and worldliness within the church hierarchy itself.
Which then spilled over into the church, using its spiritual power for political ends, wielding accusations of heresy against rulers like Frederick II.
Bringing us to those incredibly dramatic individual stories, Savonarola in Florence, Joan of Arc figures who gained immense popular influence but were ultimately crushed by the system.
Yeah, their fates really highlight the dangers of challenging power, especially when claims of the supernatural are involved. Then we went into that really dark territory of magic and witchcraft.
Seeing how ancient beliefs got tangled up with heresy, how fear was amplified, and how brutal methods like torture became routine, fueled by texts like the Malleus and papal bulls.
And we even saw how pure theological arguments, like the Immaculate Conception debate between Dominicans and Franciscans, could become matters of persecution and condemnation.
Which all leads back to the Inquisition, that central tool the sources describe for enforcing conformity across the board against dissenters, witches, political enemies, even theological opponents.
Yeah, its methods, its reach.
Yeah.
It was a formidable system.
So the overarching theme that seems to emerge from all these sources is really about how institutions define truth, define orthodoxy, and then enforce those definitions, often through fear and power.
And the very real, often brutal human cost for anyone who stepped outside those lines, whether they were a genuine dissenter, a political target, someone accused of witchcraft, or just on the wrong side of a theological argument.
It's a stark picture of how belief and power operated back then. So, thinking about all that, how those lines were drawn and enforced between divine inspiration and dangerous prophecy, between legitimate opposition and heresy, between folk practice and demonic witchcraft, often based on the beliefs, fears, and interests of powerful institutions. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this tell you, listening now, about the challenges we still face in figuring out truth, navigating information and misinformation, especially when powerful forces are trying to shape what you believe? How do you decide who to trust and what to accept when the stakes feel high? Something to think about.